Thank you very much all for coming. My name is Jim Watson, Professor of Energy Policy here at UCL and Director of the Institute for Sustainable Resources. I'm standing in for Catalina Spataru, my fellow Institute Director who unfortunately can't be here, but to chair this very, very important event. Catalina's obviously the Director of the Energy Institute where Steve works. So really, really pleased to introduce Steve's professorial lecture. Steve has been a professor for a little while. Usually the tradition is you become a professor and then sometime later this event happens. But this is a really important milestone in an academic career, both to become a professor but then to give this kind of lecture where it's, I guess, your chance to kind of reflect a bit on what you've done so far and perhaps a little bit on what might lie ahead as well. So Steve is going to talk about navigating the transition, reflections on the use of energy systems models. I can't think of anybody better to give a talk with this title. Steve has developed and used models inside and outside academia, I think for, well, almost 20 years, so a little while. He's been doing this in all sorts of contexts, both at a consultancy. He joined UCL back in 2013, so he's been with us for well over a decade here. Steve is an amazingly nice colleague, but extremely effective one. He's, I think, one of those people I think of as a paper machine, somebody who publishes lots and lots of papers in high-profile journals, all of which say something important. So he's not somebody who just does quantity, because I know academics like that. They do quantity, but not necessarily quality all of the time. I think Steve is somebody who does both quantity and quality. And I think the other thing that characterises his work, which I hope will come through in the way he talks about it, is that a lot of the work is very applied. It's with external organisations outside academia. There's always a societal purpose to the work he's doing, which characterises a lot of the work we do here, working with organisations from UNEP to FCDO, our Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, through to some of the NGOs campaigning to phase out oil and gas production here in the UK. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Steve. Look forward to hearing what you have to say. Steve's going to talk for around 40 minutes or so, and then there'll be time, another 20 minutes or so for questions. And if your question hasn't been answered, you can catch him over a drink outside and ask him then, because there'll be time for a drink and socialising afterwards. Over to you, Steve.
Brilliant. Thank you for that very flattering introduction, Jim. That's very kind of you. And thank you very much for coming out this evening. I really appreciate it, and I'm blown away by seeing so many of you. So many thanks again, even if it's just for the wine after the talk. That's fine. That's okay. So I've spoken to a number of colleagues about the sorts of things that I should be saying this evening, so hopefully I can do justice to this event. As Jim said, I think in short it's an opportunity for me to say something about what I've been doing for the last 15 or so years, even 20, reflect on that, and then make some sort of broadly sensible remarks about the future of the type of research that I do. And I think it also gives me an opportunity to recognise some of the brilliant people that I've worked with over the years that have enabled me to do really interesting and hopefully impactful research. I wasn't sure what picture to use on my title slide, so I just picked this one because I like it. But it's a picture of the Olkaria geothermal complex in Kenya, located in the aptly named Hell's Gate National Park, where I went walking with my partner, now my wife, back in 1998. No idea that this existed. But anyway, I couldn't think of another image, and I like this one. I think it's relevant in the sense that it's a key part of Kenya's energy transition, where we've been working intensively over the last 4 years. Okay, so in a nutshell, what have I been doing? I mean, I think the title of the slide encapsulates it, using energy system models to assess how we can decarbonise the national and global energy system and to help think through the broader implications on economy and society. Now, this chart, many of you will recognise from the Committee on Climate Change Committee's latest carbon budget report, showing how the UK aims to meet its various climate targets. And this is a sort of challenge that I've sort of largely been researching over the last few years. And as you can see, when I first got into this in 2005, so that's the first, the red marker, I'm not sure if I can use the pointer, over here, you can see we're in a very different place in terms of the energy system in the UK. I'm not taking too much credit for that reduction to where we are now, but rather flagging that there have been big changes to the system during my time as a researcher. Yeah, so my main approach has been the use of these system models that represent the whole energy system that are useful for generating insights into the broader system requirements required to meet future energy demands, such as technology choice, investment, energy production, and so on. And I think the key strength has been in providing this comprehensive, albeit high-level picture of the current and the future energy system. But as with all models, they're an abstraction of the real world and carry some important limitations, which hopefully I'll get to. Okay, so just in terms of my research journey, I have to say it's been something of a challenge putting these slides together, because I've done lots of, my journey has been somewhat sort of unconventional, varied, sometimes opportunistic, you could say, and non-linear, which some of you may find ironic. But finding a single thread or narrative, thank you, finding a single thread or narrative to pull this together has proven quite difficult. So I've tried to interweave lots of multiple threads. The first, as a researcher, sees me go from consultancy, then joining UCL as an early career researcher, and then becoming an academic. The second, on methods, moving from something of a deterministic way of looking at the world through optimization towards uncertainty and greater appreciation of socio-technical nature of transitions. The third boundary is about where my research has gone, from the UK focus to global and to a range of other countries. And then fourth, landscape. I mean, it's simply about the changing world and the varied policy contexts that I've found myself in. I've still structured the presentation to capture 3 time periods. My early years as a consultant, because I think that's an interesting place to start. Then as an early career researcher, trying to find my way in this strange world of academia. And then finally, where I am today. So where did it all begin? I first got into this whole area of energy systems analysis as a consultant with AEA Technology, supporting various government departments with their climate and energy strategies. I was based over in the Science Park in Harwell, in rural Oxfordshire, in a building just next to the Diamond Light Source, which is that round particle accelerator building there. And actually ended up in the London office for AEA Technology in 2007, which so happened to be this very building, which was just before the Energy Institute moved in here in 2010. So I've somewhat been institutionalized, quite literally, and failed to sort of escape the confines of this building. But it's been a good place to work in the main. Okay. Right, so here are some of those early strategies I supported using this kind of energy system model. I found this actually really motivating, thinking about how the UK could change its energy system to one that was low carbon. And it was a really exciting period when the political mood was shifting towards ambitious long-term targets to reduce UK emissions. So over the course of these various strategies, you can see us going from a 60% reduction in CO2, which sounds pitiful today, to an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2008, which was obviously legislated under the Climate Change Act. Back then, we used a model called MARCAL, which was a well-known energy system model with quite a strong representation of the technological system. So this was probably the first study, very little known study, I really got my hands dirty with when it came to modelling. It published a mere 20 years ago. And apologies for the shocking graphs. My skills weren't what they are now. But the study was in support of this carbon abatement technology strategy, which focused on how we could ensure that emissions from the continued use of fossil fuels in the electricity generation system could be mitigated in view of a 60% reduction target by 2050. So what did the modelling suggest? Well, a very different one to what we envisage now. It represented a relatively low renewables future, a role for either nuclear or CCS as the other key generator, with CCS as an enabler of both gas and coal generation and hydrogen production. And this was, of course, reflective of our modelling assumptions at the time and the climate policy landscape as it was. I do think it's instructive to look at these old studies and think about their value at the time and what it tells us about the models we used. On the one hand, you might say the models got it badly wrong, but potentially had value in other ways, which I'll come to. This next graph, courtesy of Margot Daly, shows projected renewable generation in 2050 from a range of energy system modelling studies used to support government strategy, and how the projected level in 2050 changed over time, contrasting earlier studies with the later ones. So this is over a period between 2003 and 2019. And it highlights the growing importance, obviously, of renewables in the power system in terms of generation share, but also as a key enabler of higher levels of electrification across the system. Again, changes across studies are reflective of technology assumptions based on our real-world observation and changes in climate ambition. So we can see actual system change based on the dashed lines that show levels of renewables in 2003 at 3%, growing to 50% in 2024. So we're modeling in very different environments. So what do I think the value of these studies were? I mean, the first was to establish long-term goals that now form the basis of climate ambition in the UK. They supported the idea that large-scale system change was affordable, the famous 1 to 2% of GDP, that we had options to do this, and that the pace of change in interdependencies between different sectors really mattered. There was also an important benefit to the modelling process. The nature of the models, because of their integrated nature, they enabled discussion, integration of other modelling, and testing of different assumptions. However, some important questions do emerge based on this retrospective view. Could we have done better with the assumptions we made and considered wider uncertainties? And did the model dynamics limit the insights we could infer and ensure that we were always going to be off the mark? I'm just putting those questions for you to ponder rather than to necessarily answer. Okay, so I just put these two papers up. Now, the only, I mean, they're brilliant papers, of course, but the only real reason is that these were the first that I ever did. With a chap called Neil Strachan, who unfortunately couldn't be here today while he was at Policy Studies Institute in Paul Eakins' group. This was my first exposure to thinking more deeply about the type of models that I was using and the methods I was applying. So one was about the kind of international drivers on the sort of UK system, and things like import prices, things like technology costs, the sorts of things that we don't have a handle on internally, but are important external drivers. And then the other was the sort of contribution of this kind of modeling to energy policy going forward. But yeah, it was really interesting to make that transition from consultancy to academia and start to think, actually, what am I doing here? What are these models that I'm using? How am I using them? How am I applying them? And just want to take a note to say thank you to Neil and Paul for this earlier collaboration that subsequently provided me the opportunity to join UCL in 2013. And to be honest, I only meant to stay here for 2 years. And today is literally the last thing I expected to happen back then. But that's life, isn't it? Unexpected. So joining UCL, I had the challenge of any early career researcher thinking about how to develop their research. That didn't come naturally to a consultant, where a client basically tells you exactly what research you need to do. So academia surprised me because it's all about ideas. When I arrived, I was still keen to continue my applied policy support work. Fortunately, there was an opportunity to collaborate on an international project in the run-up to COP21 with 16 other countries focused on energy system decarbonisation pathways. And later, there was an opportunity to get involved in the discussion on the UK's shift to net zero, which became an important focus after Paris. In terms of modelling approaches, one area that I'd started to develop an interest in was uncertainty analysis. Much of the scenario modelling that I'd been doing, and others, was quite deterministic. And given the huge future uncertainties in long-term transitions, it seemed like a good sort of area to sort of focus on and develop more broadly. And this sort of became a big focus of mine for the first few years I was here, and the resulting papers ultimately fed into my PhD from University College Cork, which I was awarded in 2019, so relatively recently. Okay, turning first to uncertainty analysis. As I was researching in the space, I was very much inspired by some key thinkers from the previous two decades. These included Robert Lempert from RAND, who wrote the excellent Shaping the Next 100 Years, and Funtowitz and Rivette, who wrote this great paper amongst many titled Science for the Post-Normal Age. And both argued strongly for participatory-based uncertainty analysis, given the deep underlying uncertainty facing decision makers across many issues, disagreement on the models that were being used, and on the assumptions, and differences in terms of desired outcomes. And to me, it seemed that this pretty much represented the challenge of the energy and climate strategy, and it was a useful frame for my research going forward. So I just wanted to pull out a couple of papers from that set that really fed into the PhD. Both are funded by the Energy Technologies Institute at the time, and were in close collaboration, particularly with my colleague Francis Lee. The first used an interview approach to ask a diverse set of experts their views on the most critical uncertainties faced. I think, Jim, you were one of those experts. Assessing what are the most critical uncertainties, how they can be mitigated, and how the research community can develop approaches to better support strategic decision-making in view of these kinds of uncertainties. Experts highlighted a need for a more focus on socio-political uncertainties, which models deal with very poorly, as shown the list of uncertainties on the figure on the right, and an ask for a broadening of uncertainty assessment, a steer towards robustness, not optimality, and the use of multiple models for generating more robust insights. The paper concluded the need for modeling a wider set of uncertainties, but also for decision support using models not to be constrained by what models can and cannot include. I think that's an important lesson for those working with models. The second paper used an approach called NewSAP. This considered qualitative and quantitative dimensions of uncertainty. It not only asked the question of what uncertainties matter for modeling, for modeling results, but also the quality of the assumptions going into the models based on what we call the pedigree score, which was based on different criteria about how good the assumption was, how good a proxy it was for the assumption that you're trying to represent, and the methodological rigor in terms of sort of generating that assumption. The main point was that if you do identify an important influencing factor or uncertainty in view of your results, but it's got poor pedigree, the robustness of your quantitative results could be questioned as per the upper right quadrant of this diagnostic chart. For example, in this analysis, the figure shows important assumptions around bioenergy and CCS scoring really poorly in terms of pedigree, but of key importance to the modeling results. So both studies sort of highlighted some important aspects of modeling uncertainty. Many uncertainties exist that we don't consider, and these need to be accounted for when contextualizing results. Experts vary widely as to what they think matters and how they think about uncertainty, and how modeling is very much open to values and biases. And then speaking to the community outside of your own disciplinary focus is important, although time-consuming, and often why participatory approaches often don't happen. So alongside these efforts that were maybe a bit more methodological, I was also fortunate to be involved in this Deep Decarbonisation Pathways project in the run-up to COP21 in Paris. It focused on developing long-term, low-emission development pathways and moving beyond an analysis timeframe only focused on short-term actions. So this was a really interesting initiative that saw 16 research teams from all over the world come together, work together, develop pathways that moved emission levels from where they currently sit well, so the graph is 2010 and 2050, but in 2010, you can see where per capita emissions were across a lot of countries. And the idea of this project was to see what were the pathways that actually allowed per capita emissions to converge around the 1 to 2 tons of CO2 per capita. So a really interesting exercise, everyone bringing their own context from a range of different countries. So firstly, it highlighted that it was really important for highlighting that country-level analysis was needed to fully understand the challenges of delivering international climate goals. At the time, much of the evidence, and still is the case today, was feeding in from global integrated assessment models, yet strategies and policies need to be developed at the country level where there is ownership of the analysis and the context is understood. So it's making a strong point about country-based analysis. Secondly, it demonstrated the need to think longer term, so to ensure actions undertaken today deliver in the long term and don't lock countries into misaligned actions. And finally, it crucially demonstrated that countries together could actually deliver a 2 degrees goal. And what you might find interesting now is that while we were doing this exercise, there was absolutely no discussion of 1.5 degrees at all. It was all about 2 degrees. And then, of course, that sort of temperature goal was included in Paris, which was interesting. And I think the impactful nature of the work was really to provide some technical underpinning to a specific article in the Paris Agreement called 419 on the need for long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies. And the report was widely circulated to any dignitary we could find. So you see Ban Ki-moon and Fatih Birol from the IEA and a bunch of others. So it had a lot of impact, but it also had a lot of insights into how different countries develop this kind of analysis, the kind of models they use, and some of the challenges that they face. Coming back to the UK, following COP21 in Paris, the government started to think about strengthening its own climate targets now that 1.5 degrees was in the agreement. And in 2016, the CCC initially, that's the Climate Change Committee, initially advised against increasing reductions beyond the 80% target that we already had in legislation. But then came the publication of the IPCC special report on 1.5, and the government then moved to establish a net zero target under the Climate Change Act based on new advice from the committee. And we were really active in this period, producing what I think is one of the earliest national peer-reviewed studies to consider net zero. We aim to show when the UK needed to get to net zero based on different allocations of the global carbon budget, the enabling conditions and what led to failure to achieve such goals. So this chart on the bottom right shows the kind of trajectories we were using and where they landed in terms of the kind of net zero year. One of the interesting outcomes of the analysis was the lack of flexibility we had in the model and the strong uptake of carbon dioxide removals, which is essentially the removals of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, given the need to get to a net zero position. So this sort of informed our thinking going forward as to kind of like, well, how do we need to think about modeling a little bit differently? So following on the work on decarbonisation pathways, my colleague Oliver Broad and I led a paper authored with other practitioners that really took stock of the previous 5 to 6 years of analysis that we've been doing using these energy system models, particularly in view of the new challenge of modelling net zero systems. So the challenge included the obvious need for, the obvious fact that we had zero emissions headroom, that we had this increasingly critical but highly contentious role for removals, and also just the politically challenging nature of the target. 80% already felt very hard. Moving to net zero is something else. So based on a workshop, we considered 3 challenge areas to energy system models. The first was scope. So this was the extent to which we were actually representing the kinds of options that we might want to be thinking about. So this was particularly on the demand side, because the models we were using were very supply-side heavy. And also a careful consideration of carbon dioxide removal as this very highly uncertain option. On function, actually the capacity of the models to adequately represent the transition to net zero systems, so questions around feasibility, actor behavior, and policy effectiveness. And then practice, the appropriate application of models, arguing for the need for more participatory approaches, uncertainty, and engaging wider expertise. And in some way, these conversations sort of set us on a, or me, on a kind of direction in terms of the research that I've been undertaking ever since. How am I doing for time, Jim? Okay, good. Depends how many more slides I've got, right? Great, excellent. So where has this left me in terms of current research? In the last 4 to 5 years, my research has taken me in 3 directions, which are all feel a bit disparate, but maybe are connected in certain ways. So really a focus based on that previous analysis in 2017 on net zero, a focus on energy demand reduction strategies, one on fossil fuel phase out, and one on energy system planning in low and middle income countries. Elements of opportunism there in terms of funding, but also in terms of areas of interest that really was sparked by early work. So in the last remaining time, I just want to say a few words on the first 2 in the list, given time constraints. Okay, so this first area focused on the role that energy demand reduction measures could play in achieving net zero targets in the UK. It started with conversations with colleagues at UCL, particularly Oliver and James Price, and also John Barrett at Leeds, bemoaning the limited focus on demand-side measures in the UK policy discourse more generally to support net zero, and a growing emphasis on this idea of highly speculative carbon dioxide removal. This corresponded to many of the issues that we'd flagged in the Net Zero Reflections paper, a need for stronger inclusion of demand-side measures, more careful consideration of carbon dioxide removal, and by adopting a more modular modelling approach, a recognition of the need for more granularity on measures across different sectors of the economy, using sectoral models linked to the integrating modelling framework, the energy system model we'd been using at the time, called UK Times. So we set about assessing how far we could reduce energy use across all sectors, transport systems, houses, industry, and the resulting implications on the supply side, on the supply system. This included measures like improvement to efficiency of technology, of course, but also changes to social practice and energy use choices. So the analysis published in Nature Energy had this headline finding that our most ambitious scenario realized a halving of final energy by 2050, which was a very nice result. Also had a number of other sort of key insights. If you've got a smaller need for energy in terms of what we consume, that means lower carbon dioxide removal reliance, a smaller supply system, so a smaller power system, and also some kind of moderation of the scaling of investment needed to get to net zero. And interestingly, so this study was funded by the Cred Centre, and it was really an assessment of technical potential. So as modelers, we can say, yeah, that we can achieve this level of energy demand reduction, 50%. But what we've had the opportunity to go on, which is really exciting, is to look at 2 further studies to sort of dig in a bit more as to how much of that technical potential can actually be delivered. And again, this is using mixed methods approaches that don't just focus on models. First, by bringing in policymakers into the scenario development process, and then by speaking with citizens, actually talking to real people. Amazing. So the first, funded by the Government Office for Science, explored alternative futures with policymakers, featuring some futures with strong energy demand reduction options. This co-creation process with policymakers highlighted how lower energy demand futures were deemed plausible based on this intensive engagement process and counter to the usual focus on supply-side dominant futures. The second study on the right-hand side, and we've got the developer of the very nice dashboard that we created for this project. Thank you, Darren. The second study, it's still ongoing, and it's been engaging a representative citizens panel of 40 people on a range of energy demand reduction measures. It's been running for about 18 months, and it's producing some really interesting insights as to what actions people might be willing to take and under what conditions. And again, I think is likely to provide new evidence on higher levels of acceptability of energy demand reduction measures that might be counter to what decision makers tend to think. Okay, now I make quite a turn in a different direction to the other side of the Sankey diagram, to questions about the role of fossil fuels in the energy transition. I've been drawn to research in this space, partly because I think questions of fossil fuel phase out have been under-researched, and it seems to be hugely important in achieving our climate goals, as we all know. So obviously the key driver to reducing fossil fuels is, of course, a reduction in demand. However, understanding the implications of this on fossil fuel producers and possible supply-side initiatives also seems key to me. The impetus in this area, of course, comes from the brilliant work of a number of PhD students, two of whom are in the room, Dan and Dan. Starting with actually Christoph Maglady's at the IEA and his seminal 2015 paper in Nature with Paul Eakins on the geographical distribution of fossil fuels unused when limiting global warming to 2 degrees. And on the back of this, a range of different modelling tools have and are being developed to better understand fossil fuel markets and prospects for producers. This includes energy system models that provide this global economy-wide perspective, but also much more granular field-level models that are important for understanding implications for specific producers, countries, and commerciality of specific projects. But so the paper that really launched my focus in this space was a follow-up to that Maglade and Eakins paper led by Dan Welsby with James Price and Paul again, which was published in Nature. The headline finding was what share of fossil fuel reserves had to stay in the ground to ensure limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees was achievable. And you can see the headline numbers of around 90% of coal reserves and around 60% of oil and gas reserves needs to stay in the ground. And it said something about the prospective reduced value of reserves to producers if we were going to be serious about climate change, and the necessary decline rates of production. And it got a lot of media attention and became an important paper for many civil society organizations. The top figure is from the Guardian, which focused on the kind of loss of asset value, while the bottom one shows how scientists for Extinction Rebellion went about using the paper by literally sticking it to the relevant UK government department. Further studies followed based on a kind of normative framing, so assessing what would be needed under different climate targets. The study, which has been a series of studies on the left-hand side, is the production gap report, which shows the mismatch between planned production and the required fossil fuel decline trajectories under Paris-aligned commitments, resulting in what's known as a production gap. The middle paper was an attempt with a production gap report authors to deep dive into scenarios to explain why high levels of oil and gas are still seen in so-called Paris-aligned scenarios based on a number of factors, again, coming back to carbon dioxide removal and assumptions about coal decline. And then the third paper, the recent paper published in Science with colleagues Fergus Green and Greg Muttit, argued for a new norm of no new fossil fuel projects, establishing that new projects are not required under a Paris-aligned objective of 1.5 degrees, in line with the IEA's finding based on their net zero emissions scenarios. These studies have been really cool to be involved in, have led to strong engagement on the UK oil and gas phase-out debate, where we've been working with organisations such as Uplift, and on various legal cases focused on oil and gas investors, companies and projects. We've also been focusing on developing tools and analysis on transition risk, so the loss of asset value associated with declining demand. So this has included a focus on different producing regions in Latin America and Africa, working with multilateral development banks, development partners, and other organisations such as Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. Okay, now we come to the soul-searching part of the talk. So where do we go from here? So here's some provocations. So energy system models have been used a lot over the last 20 years, and hopefully I've highlighted some of the benefits and some of the kind of interesting research outputs. I think, however, it's worth stepping back and having a hard think about their ongoing application in the energy and climate space. So here are some provocations. So firstly, a focus on policy implementation. Energy system models have been very valuable in helping shape longer-term strategy. However, there now seems to be a stronger need to focus on policy implementation. So not where do we want to get to, but how do we want to get there? And there's a question about whether these models remain applicable in that sense. And perhaps we have a good understanding about what our long-term strategy is anyway. So do we need more insights on that? Okay, that's the first one. I'm not saying either way what I think. I'm just putting these out there. The other one is this idea of an emerging electricity dominant system, where electrification has really emerged as the pathway that most people are betting on. Given that, how important is the ability to trade off between alternative pathways, which is what energy system models were very good at in the early days? And with a focus on electrification, there's also questions as to the ability of energy system models to deal with necessary spatiotemporal resolution. On digitization and decentralization, there's the nature of the future electricity system and what that looks like, one that's more decentralized and maybe enabled with digital technology. And the question is, how well can energy system models capture such aspects? And then finally, in an increasingly fractious world where socio-political factors increasingly matter, are these models able to effectively capture some of those dynamics? So, based on how you see those challenges, I think there's three strategies we can consider. I'm going to ask each of you to put your hand up, depending on... No, I'm not really. First, cease and desist switch, where we essentially stop using energy system models so much in the main and develop and use other tools. For me, this seems to be a little extreme, given, in my opinion, there is still some value in these models. And good research continues to emerge. Second, there's a school of thought that argues for improvements to the modeling paradigm, perhaps trying to incorporate improved behavioral representation, macroeconomics, and innovation effects within this specific paradigm that energy system models use. In my experience, that doesn't work, and rarely do the enhancements that people work on get adopted for continued use. So I'm going for the, not sitting on the fence, but the hybrid approach, which is really about being more modular in design and adopting a plurality of models to fit for specific purposes. I think a hybrid approach, in my mind, has the following features. So modularity, linking energy system models with more granular sectoral models approaches to better inform policy design and implementation, which I think is the approach we took in the kind of energy demand reduction work. A shift away from optimality towards robustness under uncertainty, developing and utilizing approaches such as robust decision-making and modeling to generate alternatives, just to name two. Then, when using energy system models, maybe a push towards analysis that incorporates or improves empirical underpinning, and a more exploratory framing to scenarios. For example, recent studies we've done have used historical data to assess green steel deployment and coal phase-out rates based on analogous historical transitions. So we've been sort of moving in that direction a little bit. And then stronger consideration of socio-political feasibility informed by participatory approaches and different methods and perspectives. This includes the use of systems mapping, political and economy analysis, and approaches that we've really been trying to use alongside models in some of the work we've been doing in lower and middle income countries. So the test will be whether these models can escape from model land, a term coined by my colleague Erica Thompson at Steep in her brilliant book by the same title. Definitely recommend you go out and buy that. And can they continue to provide useful real-world insights? And I think there's some responsibility on modelers to ensure that approaches used are both relevant and appropriate. And this has really come into sharp focus when doing research in the last few years in low and middle income countries who face a bunch of unique challenges for which ESM, energy system models, might not be best suited. I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your attention and look forward to some questions.
Right. Well, thanks. That was truly great. Thank you for, I guess, reminding us all the developments over the last 20 years, not just in policy and in progress on the energy transition, but also how models have changed and the questions have changed. A new way to disseminate your research: stick the paper to the wall of DESNIS, which may not be there the next day, and some important challenges at the end, and we can all think about where we are on your different options for where we go from here. I'm going to throw it open to questions. We've got a good 15-20 minutes for questions. I'll take them in groups of 2 or 3. Please ask a question and don't make a long speech. But other than that, all questions welcome. Mark, I think you're first because your hand shot up.
Thanks, Jim. So, Steve, great to see the MDU sort of punchline at the end. So I've got 3 questions, nesters, non-linear in linkage. So the first one is, how do we deal at the modelling level with the fact that initial modelling approaches were technocentric, and therefore the uncertainty was more alloteric, and now more of the uncertainty is more epistemic as a function of the system complexity of integrating increasing amounts of intermittent technologies into these systems. So that's one. The next thing is, how do we integrate decision-making around the role of strategic investment around the role of a firm? It's about policy translation to the role of the firm, strategic investment, which the modelling community really struggles with, particularly health systems people. And then the key issue with regards to those excellent points that you made at the end, which is effectively DNDU, is decision makers. We keep getting policy makers who ask questions, the answers to which are unknown and unknowable. So there's an element of not only the scope, function and practice, that brilliant paper you wrote in 2021, but it's about educating and generating capacity around policymakers and decision makers more broadly around asking questions which have a falsification construct and therefore can be actually generate some kind of falsification of provability and therefore be factually more robust using the decision approaches that you apply.
Thank you, Mark. That'll keep you busy, Steve, for a little while. I am going to ask if there's a couple more to add. There's one at the back there.
Hi, Lisa Fischer, E3G. I was interested under the aspect of uncertainty, where you see the potential to get stronger, better models and articulation of path dependency and optionality, which I think is what decision makers are very interested in.
Thank you. Thank you. Another good question. One more? Okay, that's plenty to be getting on with, Steve, so please, over to you.
Yeah, thank you for sending me over some easy questions there, Mark. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, starting with your point on policymakers, I think this is a really hard discussion to have with policymakers around uncertainty in terms of, there's always the classic, we need the answers. We need the answers with some level of certainty, which we know doesn't exist. So I think there does seem to be, so we work closely with DESNES on some of their modelling, and there does seem to be an interest in terms of sort of expanding the kind of classical scenarios-based analysis into something that is maybe a bit more DMDU focused. DMDU is decision-making under deep uncertainty for anyone who's wondering. So I think there is an appetite to go there, but I think, as you say, it's a question of kind of both from a modelling community thinking about actually how do we communicate, and also from a policymaker perspective is kind of like them understanding a little bit about the sort of benefits of that kind of analysis. But there does seem to be that appetite of from a policymaker's perspective, that there's huge uncertainty, lots of people are throwing lots of pathways at us and scenarios. How do we actually, what's important in all of that noise? And I think, some of the methods you mentioned speak to that. Decision-making at the role of the firm, absolutely critical, and something that we don't do particularly well. The thing with the energy system models, I suppose, is the aggregation. So you're trying to capture lots of information. You're trying to capture lots of sectors. You therefore have to make sacrifices in terms of both the dynamics, potentially, maybe that's not the case going forward, but also in terms of the sort of level of detail. And firm-level decision-making, just apart from the very sort of basic, firms being cost-optimal producers. I mean, apart from that, all of those sort of all of that heterogeneity across firms, all of the other sort of factors they factor in terms of the decisions they make and the investments they make, we need to do a better job with. And I'm not sure it's this kind of modelling, but I mean certainly, there are other approaches that might be. That might be useful for that. Your first point about uncertainty being epistemic, I lost track of that.
When you have low levels of intermittent generation of solar and wind, the uncertainty factors are basically more techno-economic because boundary conditions in the energy system are pretty fixed based on the long run way that the base load stuff generated. But as you get an increasing proportion and spatially heterogeneous level of intermittent generation that's going up the low voltage to the T&D, the system then amplifies in complexity the more that you have. And obviously Boris Johnson and a lot of the people have been saying let's go for 50 megawatts of offshore wind and so on, 4 gigawatts of offshore wind. So we've got increasing system complexity, which is very hard to actually capture.
Sure.
So what I'm saying is that a lot of the early work that was done with what we consider those 20 graphs were actually quite good, relatively good, because we're dealing with more alloteric concepts. You found it. Whereas when it comes to the small systems and spatially heterogeneous side, we're then dealing with a lot more complexity and huge amounts of emergence that you just can't model. We've got to now too great to ignore that.
I mean, I think there's some big challenges there. I mean, just in terms of the nature of how the system's changing from the centralized, decentralized, consumer, prosumer. Getting a handle on the sort of different actors in the system, getting a handle on the still the sort of key spatiotemporal questions, and as you say, sort of trying to model something that's more emergent, I think is a big challenge. I'm not sure I have all of the answers, but certainly am aware of the challenge. Okay, great. That sounds like a plan. That's how I do research. Lisa, on this kind of ideas of sort of path dependency. Yeah, I mean, I think previously we've not necessarily handled that in a particularly robust way, and I think that part of that has been this idea of sort of perfect foresight and the sort of knowledge of the whole time period that you're modeling, which of course is unrealistic. Models that are more sort of myopic, that can kind of handle those questions of path dependency, I think are out there, and I think we need to bring more of those in, particularly when we're thinking about the sort of uncertainties associated with that.
Thanks, Steve. Other questions? Oh, good. Other people. Please, in the front row, and then we'll go here.
Hi, thank you. So Donald Mackenzie famously said that models are an engine, not a camera, in the sense that they're not there just to take a snapshot of what exists, but to push it and to shape what the system will look like in the future. And I think the energy system models that you've shown are a good example of that. I suppose I also reflect that perhaps good academics are more engine than camera in the same sense. So I wondered if you might reflect on the sort of next few years, or what are the opportunities to shape and push the system that energy systems models or other similar modelling activities can take up that you'll be pushing forward.
Thank you. Michael? Yeah, go to Michael first and then Paul.
Thanks. Yeah, a question really, Steve, around the sort of state of the art or views for models into two closely related things. One is following up the question about firm. It's very hard for models to model the behaviour of lots of firms, but sectors have characteristics. So fossil fuel is a high-risk, high-return sector. That's why there's a lot of money in firms and the whole financial ecosystem. Whereas a lot of renewables are in electricity, which tend to be lower risk, lower return, very different mindset, capital structures, etc. So you don't have to get to firm level in order to actually think about some key characteristics. Second, closely related, is for decades, the main narrative of the renewable sector, if I can call it like that, is it's going to be cheaper than fossil fuels. And the paradox is, of course, the more renewables or low carbon you have, the less fossil fuels you're consuming. So any economist would say, well, fossil fuels are going to get cheaper and cheaper, aren't they? So to what extent do models actually reflect that reality that you have? You could argue, well, if you look back at the first one, where you want to get to is where the fossil fuel industry turns out to be high risk and low returns, because fossil fuel prices are actually systematically low because we're losing so little of them. But to what extent do your models have insights? Do you see a lot of work in those areas?
Thanks, Michael. And then a third one over here. And then we'll do another round after that.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Steve, for a really great historical overview of your intellectual journey, all fascinating. I was very interested that you arrived at some point beyond optimization, if you like. Now, the economic analogue to optimization, of course, is benefit-cost analysis. And indeed, a lot of the IAMs in the 90s were dealing with benefit-cost analysis, and that kind of analysis of climate change got Nordhaus a Nobel Prize. I've been increasingly dissatisfied with that over the time, and moving much more towards risk-opportunity analysis, given that the uncertainties and particularly the dangers are beginning to become, of climate change, are becoming much more apparent, but also the uncertainties of mitigation, etc. To what extent can you imagine your modelling approaches moving towards risk-opportunity analysis, and how might we develop that approach?
Thank you. Some other easy questions for you, Steve. Over to you. This is what happens when you become a professor.
Oh my goodness me! Wow. How much time have we got?
Oh, I'm going to keep you here till you've answered them. So.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Where to start? Yeah. I mean, Michael, really interesting observations around, the difference between renewable investment, fossil fuel investment. I think there's lots of uncertainty around this kind of mid-transition phase and what sort of supply demand dynamics will look like particularly for the fossil fuel sector. I mean, the IEA sort of have the sort of low demand scenarios going forward that obviously result in lower prices, and what does that mean in terms of the decisions, the choices that people make. I think there's a lot of uncertainty on the supply side as to kind of how fossil fuel firms, producers, OPEC will actually manage that decline and what that will do in terms of prices going forward. Will it stabilize them? Will it keep them relatively high? I think it's also a really interesting observation you make around the kind of renewables, this question of low-cost renewables. Why don't we invest in them? Why do people still invest in fossil fuels? I mean, of course, it's around the sort of profit motive. It's not about. I mean, renewables are low cost, but can you actually make a return that's of interest to you as an investor? Whereas in the fossil fuel world, it seems that you still can, there's still tons of money to be made there. And I think part of, if I can kind of go off topic slightly, I mean, just to say that I think some of our work that really focuses on transition risk and the sort of idea that supply side options could be ones that help transition us beyond what the market currently says is going to happen, I think, is an interesting space to explore. But yeah, clearly lots of uncertainty there. I mean, and then just on your point around behaviour of firms, I'm not entirely sure what the state of the art there is in terms of how you kind of model those. I think there's a lot of interest in the kind of agent-based modelling approach where you can kind of design lots of heterogeneous agents within a specific environment to kind of explore what that emergent system looks like going forward. So I think there's a lot of interest in those methods going forward, and it'll be interesting to see as time goes on the extent to which those kinds of methods break out and become important models for policy making, which energy system models as a sort of incumbent have had that incumbency benefit, but can other models kind of break through that do a better job in terms of dynamics like agent-based, socio-technical type models and make some progress there in terms of informing policy makers. And it'd be interesting to see what you think in terms of where your East project has got in terms of that. So I think you've made some brilliant progress on that. Erica, I will get to you. Paul, yeah, I mean, really interesting, this idea of shifting from benefit cost analysis to risk opportunity analysis. How do I see that happening? How do I integrate that into the modelling that I do? That's a really great question. I mean, one that we've been thinking about a fair amount, but one that I'm not sure exactly how to go. I mean, clearly, it's interesting, and I think one of the things that Michael's been arguing about is that actually, as well as there being risks in the transition, there are lots of opportunities too. And the models, I suppose, that we've used have underplayed the risks and not really shown the opportunity space from an economic point of view. So I think there's something really interesting to kind of think about there as to how we move towards modelling that better gives us insights into that. Okay, now the engine and the camera. Was your question sort of generally around where I go from here in terms of the models that I'm using? Yeah.
How they sort of influence the outside, how they shape the policy in the way that clearly they have done over the last 15 years.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's. I mean, what I'd really like to do is to keep my eye on the sort of decision maker. I mean, I've always sort of tried to do work that's somehow embedded in an applied sense in that world. So I think it's really important that we that we keep our eye on that. I mean, I think coming back to Mark's point, I think there is something to be said about using some of these kind of uncertainty methods that look at robust strategies as a way of kind of giving some of the answers that actually policymakers are asking about. They are interested in uncertainty, but they also want clear answers. And I think doing uncertainty analysis that helps to shape that, I think is really important. I think we've also seen a bit of a shift, at least in certain organizations, to a more modular, pluralistic way of doing modeling, which is very much kind of like, let's split the problem up. Let's not look at the integrated view. Let's split the problem up into its component parts and do deep dives. Think about, and this is the point around, you know, how do we use models to help us with policy, understanding policy effectiveness and policy implementation. I think from my perspective, it's about splitting the problem up and using more granular, detailed models to help us shape that. So I think it's quite helpful to have the eye on the user of models beyond the editors of journals, but people that work in ministries to think about actually what is it that they need.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to prevail on everybody's time just to have a couple more questions, one more round. I think there's a question at the back there. There's a hand here. And I will take a third one if there is a third one.
Hi, Jake Jones from Beringa. My question would be, I found it really interesting your point about kind of the moving perhaps away from optimal and kind of more to kind of robustness. And the question would be, kind of which parameters do you think perhaps are becoming a bit more redundant in your modelling, and which ones are becoming more important to try and reflect that resilience and robustness in the model?
Thank you. Somebody here? There we go. One more?
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Emma Beale. I work in the waste and resources industry, and I model not the inputs that you're modelling, but the outputs and what's actually coming out the other end. I'm really interested in that graph that you showed with the plan of decarbonisation pathways, the bubbles 2010, and how we were going to get it down. And I wonder if you have the reality graph to show us where we actually got to, and if that, you know, if we can start maybe telling stories about the uncertainty in order to have that wider dialogue with not just policymakers but all the public, so that people can really get on board with what needs to happen next.
Thank you. I think there's one more right in the back corner, just there.
Hey Stephen, thank you for the talk today. Given that policymakers are less comfortable with uncertainty, how do you see the appetite of more like uncertainty-based research evolving, and from what sectors might that come from, especially in regards to like an increase in renewables fuel mix, which might be harder to model?
Thank you. So that's 3 more for you. Steve, I'm going to add one just for
Oh,
the end,
brilliant.
which is
Thanks, Jim.
you said you were surprised to be still in Central House after all this time. But what other things would have surprised you if you can think yourself back to 2005? You know, where we are now. What's your greatest surprise, either about, you know, the field you're in, or about the outcome of the pathway we're on? So,
Yeah, brilliant.
over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. I mean, so the first question around optimality to robustness, what are maybe the kind of redundant parameters and what are more important? I think. I mean, of course. I mean, lots of things in the models are still important in terms of, you know, what we're exploring from an uncertainty point of view, stuff around technologies that, you know, we don't necessarily in the UK context know what technology costs are going to be in the future. Potentially, we don't know what import prices are going to be. We have some questions about different resources, the uptake of, you know, deployment of hydrogen electrolyzers, CCS, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of relevant stuff in there. I think what is interesting are the uncertainties that we don't include, or we don't include at the moment in the modelling. which are maybe more sort of the kind of socio-technical, political uncertainties. And the question is, how do we incorporate those into models? Do we actually incorporate them into models? You know, colleagues have gone after incorporating things like political capital into models, and I'm not sure that you want to push models onto everything. So the question is, how do you bring those uncertainties into either into your models or into sort of contextualizing your results and framing the discussion more broadly with decision makers who might not be so aware of those uncertainties. On the 2010 to 2050 bubbles, that's what I've written down. I know that wasn't your question, but I agree. I think we want to tell stories. I think I'm not very good at that in the sense that I use, you know, we don't just want graphs and scientific data. We want actual stories about what's been happening in the real economy in different sectors, and some of the good news stories and some of the stuff that we failed at. And I think more research on failure is a good direction to go in too. Just in terms of the reality, I mean, the modelling that I used to do was very kind of like, yeah, deterministic, didn't really think about uncertainty, and obviously then gave a pretty rosy picture about what was going to happen. So over the years, we've definitely taken more account of some of the questions of feasibility, different constraints, whether that be around critical materials, supply chains, whether that be around looking at sort of historical analogues of what's gone on previously, to really sort of embed into our modelling something of a more plausible, realistic, feasible future. I'm not sure I quite got the question at the back. I think it was around appetite for uncertainty. I mean,
about specific sectors, I think, where that would play out, if I'm understanding right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think maybe coming back to Mark's point earlier, I mean, I think there is maybe a lack of consideration of uncertainty across lots of different analysis, when in fact it's an inherent characteristic of the kind of work that we do. And you know, I think there's a job from our side to kind of really think about how we model this, how we incorporate it, but also how we communicate it and message it. Jim, what surprised me over the last 15 years? I mean, the biggest surprise is that I'm still here, but beyond that, I don't know. I mean, I think it's been really interesting to see how the energy system has developed over time. I think going back to the early graphs, we had no concept of the kind of electricity system that we would be moving into now, which is really quite fascinating and really interesting. And also, obviously, the progress in respect of emissions reductions has been significant. Of course, there are lots of issues, and we need to go harder and faster, but obviously that's been interesting to watch over the years. Can I think about something more pithy or interesting to say? Yeah, I mean, I can tell you something about the things that I wish I'd done when I joined.
You can tell people over a drink.
Okay, I'll do that.
You can fit it into 30 seconds. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, are there, what is the unfinished business? Do you have a, you know, if you were to put it on, I don't know, number one, what's something that you really feel you haven't managed to do yet, that you wanted to do?
Learn to code properly?
No. That's a confession. Okay, well, while you ponder that further, I think we should...
Yeah, I was just waiting to go for a drink.
Yeah, no, I'm
telling you about.
Exactly, and then you can tell us all about it more. But, well, thank you very, very much, Steve. That was fascinating, a fantastic talk, and really, really reflective, particularly on grappling with uncertainty, which is never going away and is multiplying. So that's great. But really talking about how that journey has been for you and how the models you've been involved in have co-evolved with that policy landscape and actually what's happened in some of the contexts you've been working in. So it was really well communicated, really enjoyed it. And we'll look forward to you still being here in at least 15 years' time and still being surprised you're still in Central House, hopefully doing a lot of more very interesting things. So thank you once again, Steve.